Is it on here? Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. All right, Larry. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. My name is Rowena Arshad. I'm the head of School of Education, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2016 Moray House School of Education lecture. Now, Colin has been so efficient that on your seats are housekeeping arrangements. So they're all over your seat, so they'll tell you where to go and fire exit, but there's one at the back and there's one at the front, and we're not expecting any. So if it happens, it's for real. Okay, so you know the drill, slowly but quickly to the exits. The lecture will be for about 50 minutes to an hour, followed by time for questions and answers and discussion. We have a hashtag today, hashtag MHSE Fraser. So I would really encourage you to add your comments, things that strike you. Please do tweet about it because there are others following us from out of here. And we are live streaming today, and thank you, Barry, for doing that. At the end of the lecture, you're warmly invited to stay back, continue the networking and discussions, and to take part in some refreshments. Before I go on to introduce Professor Fraser, I'd like to acknowledge that this lecture has been supported by the Robertson Bequest and the Godfrey Thompson Trust. And I'm particularly grateful to Bell Chair Professor Lani Florian, who's on the table here with me, and who is also the Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the school, for her support in enabling this. As I've mentioned, this lecture is being live streamed, and we will ensure the link is up shortly. And please do share it with colleagues and friends who know might be interested but are unable to be here this afternoon. Professor Nancy Fraser is the Henry A. and Louise Loeb Professor of Political and Social Science at the New School for Social Research. She's also a professor at the Center for Gender Research at the University of Oslo, and also holds the chair in Global Justice at the Collège d'Études Mondiales in Paris. I could go on, but will not. And if you're already familiar with Professor Fraser's range of honors, honorary professorships, appointments she holds currently and has held, if you're not familiar with it, I would suggest you go to the internet and do a search, because they're just too numerous, and we want to get on with the lecture, don't we? I know many of you, like myself, will have drawn on Professor Fraser's theory of social justice, her critiques of contemporary neoliberalism, her analysis of critical theory and activism, feminism and feminist theory, theories of the state, capitalism, political economy, and so on. In fact, I know that last year, a group of colleagues here at Moray House got together to form a Nancy Fraser reading group. And in a way, that has been what has sparked today. We have, in this room, in different ways, drawn on her work, her various conceptual pieces, and to connect those to the concepts and paradigms that we might individually have been working on, and from there to consider how this works out in practice. Professor Fraser's intellectual reach, international presence, her ability to draw new approaches, I think, to classic issues or classic problems, but also the asking of questions in a way that sparks or that speaks to the issues of our times, is what makes her contribution rich, challenging, and thoughtful for so many of us. In my own area of work, which is that of looking at race, anti-racism, and race equality, it was from those lenses that I first connected with your work. All those years ago, when you wrote Rethinking Recognition in 2000, and it was in New Left Review. An article that I've used again and again, as I know many of you in this room have too, And I know that hundreds of undergrads and postgrads from Moray House have been exposed to your work as a result of our collective effort. And it's helped me to think about the place of identity or not in the bigger and more complex, multidimensional struggle for recognition, for status, but in so doing, not to take our eyes off the big picture of political mobilization and the big issues of racism and sexism and all these other areas that we work on and are active on. When I invited you to speak almost a year ago, I indicated to you I wasn't going to ask you for a title because the world changes so quickly, and therefore I didn't want to commit you to a title 12 months ago. Earlier this year, you came back with the title of this evening's lecture, From Exploitation to Expropriation, on Capitalism's Persistent Entanglement with Racial Oppression. You can imagine I was delighted. Somebody once said to me, and I'm holding it, it's sometimes the prerogative of a dean of school to pick titles and speakers that actually challenge and are people they admire. So I'm particularly pleased you're here. I was delighted because racial oppression, of course, is not fixed or constant, but changes according to economics and the narratives of dominant cultures. And the continuance of forms of racism is very much linked to matters of class, constructions of exploitation, and oppressive economic relations. So I look forward very much to the lecture, to the questions you will no doubt pose to us to think about. And it is my honor, therefore, to invite you to share your thoughts with us this evening.
Thank you so much. Now, what do I do here? Just stick it. Perfect. You got it? Okay. Beautiful. Thank you.
Got it.
Okay. Now, those are yours.
That's my glass.
Thank you very, very much, Rowena, for that really very gracious introduction and for the invitation to come here today. And thank you, Lonnie, also, and Colin Campbell and Alan Mackey and all the people who have worked hard to make this event possible. I'm thrilled to be here and to speak on this subject of capitalism and racial oppression. And I want to start by stating what I think is obvious, and that is that capitalism has always been entangled with racial oppression, which has persisted in one guise or another throughout its entire history. Nobody doubts the centrality of racial oppression to the slave-based plantation capitalism of the 19th century. But institutionalized racism was no less fundamental to the Jim Crow social democratic capitalism of the mid-20th century. Nor has it lost its structuring force in the deindustrializing subprime mass incarceration capitalism of the present era. I hope you'll forgive me these somewhat US-centric epithets, and I will certainly cop to the idea that a lot of what I have to say is motivated by specific developments going on today in the United States, but I also believe and hope and trust that what I have to say will be of broader relevance beyond the US. Let's see if that comes clear. Now, these three regimes that I've just mentioned differ very importantly from one another, and I'll touch a bit more on those differences later on. But I want to insist at the outset that all of them are deeply racialized. Historically speaking, capitalist society in all of its forms to date has been persistently entangled with racial oppression. Now, at first sight, this entanglement may seem puzzling. On its face, a social system oriented to the endless expansion of capital ought to be indifferent to questions of color. fueled by the drive to extract as much surplus value as possible in the course of production. Such a system should, in principle, seek to enlarge the pool of skilled productive workers, dissolving outmoded racial hierarchies in what Marx and Engels famously called the icy waters of egotistical calculation. Seen that way, in terms that stress the abstract character of the law of value, capitalism's persistent entanglement with racial oppression can only appear as an anachronism, an irrational holdover from pre-capitalist times that must eventually disappear. And yet it does not disappear, which prompts me to think that perhaps the connection between capitalism and racial oppression is not, after all, so fortuitous. Perhaps the view of capitalism as an inherently colorblind system of accumulation through labor exploitation is mistaken. Perhaps capitalism itself must be understood differently, as structurally and functionally primed to divide populations in ways that correlate with, and indeed that fabricate, what we call race. This is the hypothesis I want to try to defend here in this lecture, and I have to say that my effort is inspired in part by a promising new wave of militant anti-racist mobilization in the United States, namely the Black Lives Matter movement. My effort stands, too, on the shoulders of a long and distinguished tradition of critical theorizing. Often referred to as Black Marxism, this tradition includes such towering figures as C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, Oliver Cromwell Cox, Eric Williams, Stuart Hall, Walter Rodney, Angela Davis, Manning Marable, and I could go on and on. Drawing inspiration from their insights, I want to try to make my case here in two main steps. First, I'm going to propose a conception of capitalism that, unlike familiar approaches, focuses on the structural basis of its entanglement with racial oppression. And then, once I've elaborated that conception schematically, I'm going to proceed in my second step to historicize it, to try to shed some light on the specific character of racial oppression in the 21st century. So, okay, step one. Capitalism is often understood narrowly as an economic system simpliciter. That, of course, is the mainstream view, which equates it with private property and market exchange. Now, in part because this view naturalizes and dehistoricizes those categories, it has been roundly criticized. Left-wing thinkers in particular have faulted it for obfuscating the system's distinctive mechanisms of accumulation and domination. Elaborating critiques of political economy, they have proposed broader and far less rosy understandings of capitalism. Without question, Marx's is the most influential of these critiques, and to my mind, the most convincing. Famously, his account penetrates beneath the market perspective of the system's apologists to the more fundamental level of commodity production. There, it discovers the secret of accumulation in capital's exploitation of wage laborers. Importantly, these workers are neither serfs nor slaves, but unencumbered individuals, free to enter the labor market and sell their labor power. In reality, of course, they have little actual choice in the matter. Deprived of any direct access to the means of production, they can only secure the means of subsistence by contracting to work for a capitalist in exchange for wages. And the transaction does not redound primarily to their benefit. What, from the market perspective, is an exchange of equivalence is, from this Marxian view, a kind of sleight of hand, recompensed only for the socially necessary cost of their own reproduction. Capitalism's workers have no claim whatever on the surplus value their labor generates, which accrues instead to the capitalist. And that, for Marx, is precisely the point. The crux of the system, on his view, is the exploitative relation between two classes. On the one hand, the capitalists who own the society's means of production and appropriate its surplus. On the other, the free but propertyless producers who must sell their labor power piecemeal in order to live. This relation defines the essence of capitalism as a mode of accumulation that is simultaneously a system of domination. Capitalism, on Marx's view, is no mere economy, but a social system of class domination. Its cornerstone is the exploitation of free labor by capital in commodity production. I think most of you know all this. I just remind you at the outset. Now, this perspective is immensely clarifying as far as it goes, but absent some supplementation, it cannot explain why and how capitalism is deeply entangled with racial oppression. The trouble is, the Marxian perspective focuses attention on capital's exploitation of wage labor in commodity production. In its usual guise, therefore, it marginalizes some equally fundamental processes that are bound up with that one. Two such processes are essential for theorizing the racial dynamics of capitalist society. The first is the crucial role played in capital accumulation by unfree, dependent, and unwaged labor, by which I mean labor that is expropriated as opposed to exploited, subject to domination, unmediated by a wage contract. The second key process concerns the role of political orders in conferring the status of free individuals and citizens on those who count as workers, while constituting others as lesser beings. For example, as chattel slaves, indentured servants, colonized subjects, native members of domestic dependent nations, as native peoples have been called in the United States judicial cases, as debt peons, as convicted and incarcerated felons, as covered beings, such as wives and children, who lack an independent legal personality. Now, clearly, both of these matters, dependent labor and political subjection, are fundamental for understanding race. But both are also integral to the constitution of capitalist society. In a nutshell, as I'm going to try to explain, the subjection of those whom capital expropriates is a hidden condition of possibility for the freedom of those whom it exploits. And I want to repeat that. It's a somewhat complicated sentence, but it is the essence of what I'm trying to show here. So let me repeat it. The subjection of those whom capital expropriates is a hidden condition of possibility for the freedom of those whom it exploits. If we don't have an account of the first, the subjection of the expropriated, then we will not be able to fully understand the second, the freedom of the exploited. Nor will we be able to fully appreciate the non-accidental character of capitalism's historic entanglement with racial oppression. Okay, to try to develop this claim, I am going to utilize what I call an expanded conception of capitalism. in place of the two-level picture Marx gave us, which comprises first the apologist level of exchange, plus the so-called hidden abode of exploitation, my conception will suppose a three-tiered model, which also encompasses the even more obfuscated moment of expropriation. So I've got three X's: exchange, exploitation, expropriation. By adding this third non-contractual X, I'm going to disclose the centrality of racialized dependent labor to capitalist society. The effect will be to broaden our understanding of what capitalism is. Like Marx's conception, mine includes the political economy he theorized, but it also encompasses the latter's non-economic background conditions of possibility, among which I include political power. By conceiving that extra-economic realm as an integral constituent of capitalist society, I'm going to foreground the centrality of racialized political subjection in a system oriented to the endless accumulation of surplus value. Together, these revisions will provide at least some of the conceptual resources we need to clarify capitalism's deep-seated and ongoing entanglement with racial oppression. Okay, let me begin with expropriation. Distinct from Marxian exploitation, but equally integral to capitalist development, expropriation is accumulation by other means, dispensing with the contractual relation through which capital purchases labor power in exchange for wages. Expropriation works by confiscating capacities and resources and conscripting them into capital's circuits of self-expansion. Now, the confiscation may be blatant and violent, as in New World slavery, or it may be veiled by a cloak of commerce, as in the predatory loans and debt foreclosures of the present era, and I will come back to that. The expropriated subjects may be rural or indigenous communities, or they may be members of subject and subordinated groups in the capitalist core. They may end up as exploited proletarians if they're lucky, or if not, as paupers, slum dwellers, sharecroppers, natives, or slaves, subjects of ongoing expropriation outside the wage nexus. The confiscated assets may be labor, land, animals, tools, mineral or energy deposits, but also human beings, their sexual and reproductive capacities, their children, and bodily organs. The conscription of these assets into capital's circuits may be direct, involving immediate conversion into monetized value, as again in slavery, or it may be mediated and indirect, as in the unwaged labor of family members in semi-proletarianized households. What is essential, however, is that the commandeered capacities get incorporated into the value-expanding process that is capital. Simple theft is not enough. Unlike the sort of pillaging that long predated the rise of capitalism, expropriation in the sense I intend here is confiscation cum conscription into accumulation. Now, expropriation in this sense covers a multitude of sins, most of which correlate strongly with racial oppression. The link is clear in practices widely associated with capitalism's early history, but still ongoing, such as territorial conquest, land annexation, enslavement, coerced labor, child abduction, and rape. But expropriation also assumes more modern forms, such as prison labor, transnational sex trafficking, corporate land grabs, and foreclosures on predatory debt. Finally, expropriation plays a role in the construction of distinctive and explicitly racialized forms of exploitation. As, for example, when a prior history of enslavement casts its shadow on the wage contract, segmenting labor markets and levying a confiscatory premium on exploited proletarians who carry the mark of race long after their emancipation. I'll come back to some examples of that. In that last case, expropriation combines with exploitation, whereas in the others, it appears to stand alone. But in all these cases, it correlates with racial oppression, and for reasons that are non-accidental, as we shall see. Far from being sporadic, moreover, expropriation has always been part and parcel of capitalism's history, as has the racial oppression with which it is linked. No one doubts, as I said at the outset, that racially organized slavery, colonial plunder, and land enclosures generated much of the initial capital that kick-started the system's development. But even mature capitalism relies on regular infusions of commandeered capacities and resources, especially from racialized subjects, in both its periphery and core. Historically, expropriation has always been entwined with exploitation in capitalist society, just as capitalism has always been entwined with racial oppression. But the connection is not just historical. There are structural reasons for capital's ongoing recourse to expropriation, hence, as we'll see, for its persistent entwinement with racial oppression. By definition, a system devoted to the limitless expansion and private appropriation of surplus value gives the owners of capital a deep-seated interest in acquiring labor and means of production below cost, if not simply gratis, and not only by virtue of greed. The uses of expropriation are clear whenever the difference between profit and loss turns on the availability of cheap inputs, such as energy and raw materials, and on the availability of cheap consumer goods, above all food and textiles, which lower the costs of labor's reproduction. In other words, expropriation enables capital to reduce wages on the exploited, and thereby to raise the rate of exploitation, and so, within the orthodox Marxian framework, to counter the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Advantageous even in normal times, this strategy becomes especially appealing in periods of crisis, when competition is intense, recent productivity gains have been generalized, ecological degradation raises costs, and/or profit rates fall below what are considered acceptable levels. In those times, which occur periodically and for non-accidental reasons in the course of capitalist development, expropriation serves as a critical, if temporary, fix for restoring profitability and navigating crisis. Absent the ability to commandeer the labor and natural resources of dispossessed and often racialized populations, individual firms would perish, and the system's recurrent profitability crises would be harder to resolve. The same is true for the system's political crises, which can sometimes be tempered or averted by transferring value confiscated from populations that appear not to threaten capital politically to those that do. And this is another distinction that often correlates with race. No wonder then that a line of thinkers stretching from Rosa Luxemburg to David Harvey to Jason W. Moore have conceived what I am calling expropriation as a built-in feature of capitalism, as integral to sustained accumulation as is exploitation. In the view I'm developing here, which combines their insights with insights from the Black Marxist tradition I evoked earlier, the distinction between those two X's, expropriation and exploitation, correlates roughly but unmistakably with what Du Bois called the color line. On this view, the expropriation of racialized others constitutes a necessary background condition for the exploitation of workers. The thesis that expropriation enables exploitation has some affinities with Marx's account of primitive or original accumulation, as he called it. Both ideas serve to reveal capitalism's disavowed confiscatory underside. Both make visible the violence and theft concealed beneath the orderly facade of contractual relations and market exchanges. But they differ in two respects. First, primitive accumulation denotes the blood-soaked process by which capital was initially stockpiled at the system's beginnings. Expropriation, in contrast, designates an ongoing confiscatory process essential for sustaining accumulation in a crisis-prone system. Second, Marx introduces the idea of primitive accumulation to explain the historical genesis of the class division between propertyless workers and capitalist owners of the means of production. Expropriation explains that as well, but it also brings into view another social division, equally deep-seated and consequential, but not systematically theorized by Marx. I mean the social division between the free workers whom capital exploits in wage labor and the unfree or dependent subjects whom it cannibalizes by other means. That second distinction has everything to do with race and is central to the present inquiry. My thesis, once again, is that the racializing dynamics of capitalist society are crystallized in the mark that distinguishes free subjects of exploitation from dependent subjects of expropriation. But to make this case requires a shift in focus from the economic to the political. It is only by thematizing the political order of capitalist society that we can grasp the constitution of that distinction, and with it, the fabrication of race. So, consider that the distinction between expropriation and exploitation is simultaneously economic and political. At one level, call it economic, and that's the register in which I've been speaking up till now. These terms name mechanisms of capital accumulation, analytically distinct, yet intertwined ways of expanding value. At another level, however, they implicate hierarchical political relations and legal statuses, which distinguish rights-bearing individuals and citizens from subject peoples, unfree chattel, and dependent members of families and subordinated groups. In capitalist society, as Marx insisted, exploited workers have the legal status of free individuals, authorized to sell their labor power in return for wages. Once separated from the means of production and proletarianized, they are protected, at least in theory, from further expropriation. In this respect, their status differs sharply from those whose labor, property, and/or persons are still subject to confiscation on the part of capital. Far from enjoying protection, the latter populations are defenseless, fair game for expropriation again and again. Now, this contrast is eminently political. The paradigmatic agencies that afford or deny protection are states, although geopolitical arrangements are also implicated, as we shall see. Thus, the social division between the exploited and the expropriated does not arise simply from capitalism's economy. It is produced rather at the intersection of the system's economic logic with its political order. It is by means of this double or joint determination, at once economic and political, that racial hierarchy and imperial predation are anchored in the depths of capitalist society. To see why, consider that capitalism's economic subsystem depends for its very existence on conditions external to it, including some that can only be assured by public political powers. Obviously, accumulation requires a legal framework to guarantee property rights, enforce contracts, and adjudicate disputes. Equally necessary are repressive forces, which suppress rebellions, maintain order, and manage dissent. Then, too, political initiatives aimed at managing crisis have proved indispensable at various points in capitalism's history, as has public provision of infrastructure, social welfare, public goods, and, of course, money. Bound up with all of these public functions, and central to my purposes here, is political subjectivation. By this I mean the codification by public powers of the status hierarchies that distinguish citizens from subjects, nationals from aliens, entitled workers from dependent scroungers. Available in principle for racialization, status hierarchy, too, is an essential condition for accumulation, marking off groups subject to brute expropriation from those destined for mere exploitation. Constructing exploitable and expropriable subjects while distinguishing the one from the other, subjectivation is another way in which public powers enable private capital to perform its magic of self-expansion. Now, usually we equate the powers in question with the territorial states that have exercised them most overtly throughout modern history. But capitalism's political order is inherently geopolitical. Bent on limitless expansion, its economy thrives on international trade, transnationalized production, global markets, and international finance, none of which would be possible absent cross-border coordination. To achieve the latter, capitalism's economy has relied on trans-state political powers, on treaties, international law, and more recently, supranational governance regimes. Equally indispensable have been the organizational and military capacities of a succession of global hegemons, each of which has undertaken to shape or reshape an international environment conducive to sustained and ever-expanding accumulation within a multi-state system. These geopolitical arrangements also play a role in fabricating the political statuses essential to capital accumulation. At one level, the Westphalian picture of an international system of sovereign territorial states underwrites the border controls that distinguish lawful residents from illegal aliens, while also providing the template for political membership, which is typically nationalist and therefore open to racialization. Directing attention inward, this official mapping of political space has facilitated domestic democratization while truncating transnational solidarities and obscuring cross-border processes of exploitation and expropriation. At another level, meanwhile, the capitalist world system, as Wallerstein would call it, has incubated an alternative imperialist geography of core and periphery. In this unofficial but all too real mapping of space, the core has appeared as the emblematic heartland of exploitation, while the periphery appeared as the iconic site of expropriation. As I'll suggest, that's a little too simple, but it's certainly the appearance. Explicitly racialized from the get-go, the imperialist geostructure, too, generated status hierarchies: metropolitan citizens versus colonial subjects, free men versus slaves, Europeans versus natives, whites versus blacks. In general, then, a multi-leveled order, simultaneously national domestic, international Westphalian, and colonial imperialist, secures the indispensable political preconditions for a capitalist economy. All the levels work together to shape arrangements that enable exploitation on the one hand and expropriation on the other. All work together, too, to distinguish populations and regions suitable from the former from those destined instead for the latter. Now, to see how, let's look a bit more closely at political subjectivation. What is at issue here, as I've noted, is the fabrication of status, or rather of a hierarchy of different statuses suited to capitalism's disparate mechanisms of accumulation. And again, as I've said, two such statuses are especially important for understanding capitalism's persistent entwinement with racial oppression: the free exploitable citizen worker on the one hand, and the dependent expropriable subject on the other. Both these statuses were politically constituted, but the dynamics of their fabrication differed sharply. In the capitalist core, dispossessed direct producers became exploitable citizen workers, free persons, through historic processes of class struggle and class compromise which channeled struggles onto paths convergent with the interests of capital within the liberal legal frameworks of national states. By contrast, those who became ever expropriable subjects, whether in periphery or in core, found no such accommodation, as their uprisings were more often crushed by force of arms. If the domination of the first was shrouded in consent and legality, that of the second rested unabashedly on naked repression. Often, moreover, the two statuses were mutually constituted, effectively co-defining one another. In the United States, for example, the status of citizen worker acquired much of the aura of freedom that legitimates exploitation, by contrast to the dependent, degraded condition of chattel slaves and indigenous peoples whose persons and lands could be repeatedly confiscated with impunity. In codifying the subject status of the second, the U.S. state simultaneously constructed the normative status of the first. As a result, politically constructed subjection, which signified expropriability, became a badge of dishonor in a country that called itself the land of the free. Worn originally by natives and slaves, this stigma continues to burden their descendants today, long after they joined the ranks of exploited wage labor. Racializing stigmata attach as well to other expropriable subjects, such as dependent paupers, convicted felons, and ex-colonial immigrants of color. As noted, however, the political fabrication of dependent subjects within capitalism has always exceeded state borders. For systemic reasons, rooted in the intertwined logics of geopolitical rivalry and economic expansionism, powerful states moved to constitute expropriable subjects further afield, in peripheral zones of the capitalist world system. Plundering the furthest reaches of the globe, European colonial powers, followed by a US imperial state, turned billions of people into such subjects, shorn of political protection, ripe and ready for confiscation. The number of expropriable subjects those states created far exceeds the number of citizen workers they emancipated for exploitation. Nor did the process cease with the liberation of subject peoples from colonial rule. On the contrary, masses of new expropriable subjects are created daily, even now, by the joint operations of post-colonial states, their ex-colonial masters, and the trans-state powers that grease the machinery of accumulation, including the global financial institutions that promote dispossession by debt. So here are at least some of the elements needed to elaborate my central claim, namely that far from being contingent or superficial, capitalism's entanglement with racial oppression is structural and deep. Nevertheless, the case I have made here for this proposition remains schematic. To put flesh on its bones requires history. What is needed for starters, I'm moving now to the second step of the argument, is an account of the sequence of regimes of racialized accumulation that constitute the principal phases of capitalist development. As I imagine it, such an account would highlight the historically specific relations between expropriation and exploitation within each phase. For each regime, one would have to specify the geography and demography of those two X's, ascertaining the extent of their separation, the dynamics of their intertwinement, and the relative weight of each in the overall configuration. Such a project far exceeds the bounds of the present lecture, but its rough outlines are becoming clear, at least to me. Unlike schemas that begin with the liberal capitalism of the 19th century, this one has to start much earlier with the commercial or mercantile capitalism of the preceding era. It was in that phase, after all, that the confiscatory process that Marx called primitive accumulation first unleashed its violence across the globe. Well before the rise of modern industry, commercial capitalism brought not only land enclosures in the core, but also conquest, plunder, and, quoting Marx again, the hunting of black skins throughout the periphery. Prior to large-scale exploitation of factory workers in Europe came massive expropriation of bodies, land, labor, and mineral wealth in the so-called New World. Proportionately, expropriation dwarfed exploitation throughout the era of commercial capitalism. Not machinery, not land, but slaves constituted the single most valuable form of capital in early 19th century United States. Now, that initial configuration of expropriation and exploitation shifted with the abolition of slavery and the rise of mechanized manufacturing in the latter half of the 19th century. In this new regime, which is often called liberal capitalism, the confiscation of labor and land continued apace as European states consolidated colonial rule, while the US perpetuated its internal colony by transforming recently emancipated slaves into debt peons through the sharecropping system. Now, however, ongoing expropriation in the periphery entwined with highly profitable exploitation in the core. The rise of large-scale factory-based manufacturing forged the proletariat imagined by Marx, upending traditional life forms and sparking class conflict. Eventually, struggles to democratize metropolitan states delivered a system-conforming version of citizenship to exploited workers, even as brutal repression of anti-colonial struggles ensured continuing subjection in the periphery. In this regime, expropriation and exploitation appeared to be separated from one another, sited in different regions and assigned to different populations. In fact, however, the geographic division between the two X's was never so cut and dried, as some extractive industries employed colonial subjects in wage labor, and as only a minority of exploited workers in the capitalist core succeeded in escaping ongoing expropriation altogether. Despite their appearance as separate, moreover, the two mechanisms of accumulation were thoroughly and systemically imbricated in this regime. It was the expropriation of populations in the periphery, including the periphery within the core, that supplied the cheap food, textiles, mineral ore, and energy, without which the exploitation of metropolitan industrial workers would not have been profitable. In the liberal era, therefore, the two X's were distinct but mutually calibrated engines of accumulation within a single world capitalist system. The nexus of expropriation and exploitation mutated again in the following era. Begun in the interwar period and consolidated following the Second World War, the new regime of so-called state-managed capitalism softened the separation of the two X's without, however, abolishing it. In this era, expropriation no longer precluded exploitation, but combined directly with it, entering into the internal constitution of wage labor, segmenting labor markets, and exacting a confiscatory premium from racialized labor, workers who were paid less than the real costs of their social reproduction. In the United States, African Americans displaced by agricultural mechanization flocked to northern cities where many joined the industrial proletariat, but chiefly as second-class workers, paid less than whites and consigned to the dirtiest, most menial jobs. In this era of racially segmented labor markets, their exploitation was overlaid by expropriation as capital paid them less than the average socially necessary cost of their reproduction. Moreover, the mark of race, previously constituted as political subjection cum expropriability, retained its oppressive power in the form of Jim Crow, as segregation, disfranchisement, and countless other institutionalized humiliations continued to deny the status of full citizenship to African Americans. To be sure, that subordination was forcefully challenged when movements for civil rights and Black liberation erupted in the post-war era. But their victories proved fragile and partial, as the recent wave of police murders of US Blacks has made painfully clear. In the periphery, meanwhile, struggles for decolonization exploded throughout the era of state-managed capitalism. With political independence, some post-colonials managed to raise their status from expropriable subject to exploitable citizen worker, but precariously and on inferior terms. In a global economy premised on unequal exchange, their exploitation, too, was suffused with expropriation. And many, many more peripheral subjects remained outside the wage nexus and subject to overt confiscation, as the industrializing strategies of post-colonial states often entailed expropriation of their own indigenous peoples. In the era of state-managed capitalism, then, exploitation no longer appeared so separate from expropriation. Rather, the two mechanisms of accumulation became internally articulated in racialized industrial labor on the one hand and in compromised post-colonial citizenship on the other, even as the purer variants of the two X's persisted in core and periphery. Now, this brings me finally to the present regime of racialized accumulation, which I will call financialized capitalism. In this regime, expropriation is on the rise, threatening to dwarf exploitation again as a source of value and driver of capital expansion. Moreover, the geography and demography of the two X's has shifted dramatically. Much large-scale industrial exploitation now occurs outside the historic core in the BRICS countries of the semi-periphery. And expropriation has become ubiquitous, afflicting not only its traditional subjects, but also those who were previously shielded by their status as citizen workers. In these developments, debt plays a major role, as global financial institutions pressure states to collude with investors in extracting value from defenseless populations. It is largely by means of debt that peasants are dispossessed and rural land grabs are accorded a veneer of legality in the capitalist periphery. In fact, these developments are intensifying today thanks to crises of profitability and production, the overaccumulation of capital, and ecological degradation, which together inspire a new round of corporate confiscation aimed at cornering supplies of energy, water, arable land, and so-called carbon offsets. It is largely by debt, too, that accumulation proceeds in the historic core. As low-wage, precarious service work replaces unionized industrial labor, wages fall below the socially necessary costs of reproduction. In this so-called gig economy, continued consumer spending requires expanded consumer debt. Hence, the proliferation of these highly inventive but entirely dicey financial products which fatten investors and expropriate citizen workers of every color, but especially racialized borrowers who are steered to hyper-expropriative subprime loans and payday loans. In financialized capitalism, in other words, we encounter a new entwinement of exploitation and expropriation and a new logic of political subjectivation. In place of the earlier sharp divide between expropriable subjects and exploitable citizen workers, there appears a continuum. At one end lies the growing mass of defenseless expropriable subjects. At the other end, the dwindling ranks of protected, exploited citizen workers. At the center sits a new figure, formally free but acutely vulnerable, the expropriable and exploitable citizen worker. No longer restricted to peripheral populations and racial minorities, this new figure is becoming the norm in much of the historic core. Nevertheless, the expropriation-exploitation continuum remains racialized, as people of color are still disproportionately represented at the expropriative end of the spectrum. Okay, well, this schema remains quite sketchy and requires much more specification. In outlining it here, though, I have sought to convey what I think, at least, is its potential to illuminate the present conjuncture, and as well as to make a contribution to the tradition of Black Marxist thought. In this lecture, and I want to conclude on this note, I have tried to enrich that tradition in three principal ways. I've endeavored to show first that capitalism's entwinement with racial oppression is no mere fluke or historical contingency, but a feature grounded in the system's DNA. I've argued second that the structural bases of racism in capitalism are obscured by approaches that restrict themselves to exploitation. If we are to disclose them, we have to penetrate further beneath Marx's hidden abode to the even more obfuscated level of expropriation. And I've insisted, finally, that while expropriation is always a necessary condition for exploitation, its relation to the latter varies historically, according to the regime of accumulation. In this way, I've tried to do justice both to the persistence of racial oppression in capitalist society and to its historicity. I am seeking, above all, to capture the specific and novel forms this oppression assumes in the present era. My hope is that a deeper understanding of the social bases of racial oppression will foster more determined efforts to eradicate it. Thank you very much for your attention. Pick this up.
Thank you very, very much, Nancy. I know that there will be questions, many questions from colleagues in the audience, and we have 2 roving mics. But as the person tasked with managing this aspect of the event this evening, I thought I would take a moment to just make a couple of comments. One is I think you have achieved your aim in terms of the contribution that you are aiming to make to Marxist thought and helping all of us think about some of the issues of justice and injustice that we all grapple with. I think the analysis of the legacy of racial entanglement with the mechanisms of capitalism exposes a fundamental injustice in capitalist societies. And because we are in a school of education, it prompts us to think about what might constitute an appropriate response to that. Because those of us in education have a practical interest in the role that we as educators play in maintaining or transforming the status quo. So the ideas that you're presenting are of particular interest for the everyday work that we do. I think a question, and this is not necessarily a question you have to answer at this moment, but one that I'd like to just open up the broader discussion with is, how do we work for justice in terms of how you define it as parity of participation in a system of racialized accumulation? You know, that's the takeaway question for me from your lecture. And thank you so much. And let me now open up to colleagues in the room who may also want to ask Nancy a question.
Maybe take some time.
Oh, we have a question here.
Great.
Nancy, in a capitalist system where the numbers of exploitable workers are diminishing and the expropriated, the people who are expropriated, the numbers are growing, what do you see as being the effective means of resistance? Right. You talked about the Black Lives Matter project. Do you see it as effective?
Right. Thanks. That's really a very central and important question, and one that is very much on my mind, and in fact is in the background of everything that I've tried to do here. And I think I want to say 2 things. That if you take this enlarged picture of what capitalism is, as always involving both of these X's and as intertwining them in different ways historically, then you have to immediately think that effective struggles against injustice cannot be limited to struggles against exploitation, but must also include struggles against expropriation. Now, the problem is, because this division is so racialized, and because it depends upon the constitution of these distinct types of subjects, the tendency historically has been for those 2 lines of struggle to be separated from one another and often tragically counterposed against one another, right? So there's always been, whether it's anti-racist struggle or anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle, right, a tendency for that to be separated from, and in some cases polarized against, anti-exploitation struggles, class struggles in the more familiar sense. The point of this way of theorizing things would be, and does relate very closely to this problem that Lonnie raised about education and what we as educators do. I mean, my hope is that if we can make visible the ways in which these two injustices, expropriation and exploitation, are part and parcel of a single system, the way in which they are intertwined, mutually co-constituted, mutually dependent, codependent, if you like, then that immediately suggests that a viable political strategy has to involve some kind of alliance, some kind of working together, right? Some sort of sense of, yeah, that there's a single system that needs to be changed, that both of these things are anchored in and connected to one another through. Just one second. Second part, so that's the sort of larger, if you like, political takeaway that I would like people to take from this lecture. When you ask about Black Lives Matter and whether it's effective and so on, I want to say 2 or 3 different things here. One is that it's a fantastically interesting movement because it has really put the whole question of criminal justice, policing, incarceration, and so on, very front and center on the agenda. And it's insisted that we not look away from these things, that this be visible. I mean, it's not true, as one formulation of my lecture may have suggested, that you know, this police murder of Black people is some recent thing. This is very continuous, but it's spotlighted now, and it's that movement that deserves the credit for that. And the other great thing about it is that it's an entire generation of young militants. There's been a kind of hiatus in anti-racist struggle as this is what we call the post-civil rights era has unfolded, and just as I've written about with respect to feminist movements, anti-racist movements have developed a quasi-neoliberal forms that have not fundamentally challenged the system. This is a major new development, and it's a whole new generation of young activists who are, again, education, who are reading and rediscovering some of these great thinkers whose names I've mentioned, and educating themselves and reading Marx. And so I have a lot of hopes for this generation. However, having said that, I have to say that the other thing that's happening in the United States right now is the Bernie Sanders campaign. And unfortunately, these two, each of which promising developments, are a bit separated from one another. And I sort of think of it as expropriation here and exploitation here. Maybe that's too simple, actually, but it is a little too reminiscent of these historic splits in U.S. history between the quote-unquote white left and the Black liberation struggles. So I still see a separation, and that is on my mind and what it would take to overcome that separation is on my mind as I think about how to understand the relation between exploitation and expropriation today. I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement is very focused on expropriation and the legacy of all that history that I have tried to evoke, however sketchily. But all of that is so connected with the history of exploitation that it really, that the connections need to be made.
Thank you. Another question, yes. There's a microphone.
Thanks very much. And following on from that, your talk reminded me quite a lot of the work of Guy Standing and the notion of the precariat.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I saw him a couple of weeks ago. In terms of that notion of a solution, where do you stand upon the idea of a universal basic income? Because obviously his work and the small tests that he appears to have done, more so looking at gender rather than race, but appears to indicate that a universal basic income excessively benefits those that have been subjectified more so than others, because actually it removes the capacity of the dominating to employ that subjectification. They can actually extract themselves from it. So just in terms of that notion of solution, where does it feel in response to your argument?
I mean, there's a lot of interesting debate about this, and as I think you know, the sort of other side holds that UBI, especially if it's not really quite generous, it subsidizes capital and low-wage labor and so on. So I think that it's very much matters sort of how it's understood, how it's implemented, and what other things it's connected to. For example, you may know, if you followed the literature, that one of the first early philosophical papers that conceptualized and tried to defend UBI was Philippe von Parrich's beautiful paper, but with an amazing title, Why Surfers Should Be Fed. Now, what was completely sort of missed here was this sort of, that title incorporated the idea of, some unencumbered guy, out having some interesting, fun lifestyle. UBI has not been thought about in a gender-sensitive way. Because men might use it to go surfing, women will use it to support their children, and unless it's connected with other kinds of policies, it may end up probably will reinforce the gender division of domestic labor. So I don't think UBI is a panacea for everything, but it could have, in sort of pursued in the right way, connected to the right sorts of other demands and struggles, it could be an important piece of the puzzle. Certainly today, given a social landscape in which capital is simply not interested in the labor power of huge, huge numbers of people. The question of income support and maintenance and support for social reproduction is extremely pressing. Whether UBI, as opposed to a large, well-funded, and democratically sort of organized public sector of employment oriented to social reproductive services and needs, that's another sort of possible way to think about how do you guarantee income and social reproduction in a world in which capital is willing to let 2/3 of the world's population subsist outside wage labor and has no interest in them whatsoever.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. It was nice to hear someone talk about race in the context of capitalism, so I'm really pleased about that. I suppose I had a question about the role of agency in your framework. And I guess I was trying to figure out if a subject is dependent and expropriated, how do they act?
Right.
because I'm wondering, because, you know, the exploited worker, you
Right.
become a class for yourself, and you're able to, you know, you become class conscious, and you're able to take action. So
Right.
how does the dependent expropriated subject take action?
Right. That's a wonderful question, and I have to say that I mean, I'm at a rather early stage in developing what the thing that I'm trying to do here, and so I really focused on the more structural argument. And I mean, there really aren't very many agents at all in this talk as I have it now, but that's an artifact of its relatively early and undeveloped stage. It has to do that. I mean, one problem is that the whole question about subjectivation, as I've presented it here, is very one-sided. It's like a top-down thing. The states are basically fabricating the statuses through law and repression and so on. Whereas there's a whole nother side of the story of what people do with statuses foisted on them, or in some cases, statuses they've fought for themselves, and you could even say invented, as in the case of the citizen worker, or at least had a pretty heavy hand in inventing, a much heavier hand than dependent expropriated subjects have in fashioning their status. But the fact that the second group has sort of less of a say in the constitution of their status, their official status, doesn't, to my mind, mean that their agency is curtailed. Now, whether it's effective resistance or not, that's another question. But again, agency is agency, and I would, I mean, if we're talking about, I mean, agency we can talk about on many, many levels, but if we're talking about resistance, then, you know, I don't think you could quantitatively say that there's less resistance, and has been historically, among colonized people, among slaves, as there have been upon, you know, by metropolitan workers. It may have to take different forms, and we may have to enlarge our idea, following someone like James Scott, The Weapons of the Weak, and all of that, to kind of figure out what that resistance and agency looks like. And it may have faced more difficult obstacles in the sense of this very repressive response, with much less willingness to co-opt and compromise and so on the part of the powers that be. But I don't think that means that the agency is any less. And as we know, there have been extraordinary slave revolts and independence struggles and movements that have been successful. I mean, the whole history of the U.S. Civil War and of Black emancipation has been and is being rewritten as we now understand the importance of slave agency, and not just the kind of white abolitionists who have been the focus of the history of abolitionism, have been too much the main focus. So I think that's all there to be worked on, to be elaborated, and to be connected. What I've done here is a kind of preliminary mapping of some rather almost gross, broad brushstroke sorts of categories. I think they are the categories that help us understand these things better. But I would, as a critical social theorist, I will try to meet the historians halfway and ask them to give us the agency, and we'll figure out how to connect them.
I hear some great research projects in that.
Yeah.
Some potential PhD theses coming. I think we had one final question in the back. There was, or here, yes. Mike is coming.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. I think I'm neither a historian nor a sociologist, I'm actually an architect. I'm just concerned about the slightly binary nature. I think there certainly is the racial issue, but coming back on the hashtags, in Nigeria, where I'm partly from as well, there's hashtag Bring Back Our Girls.
Right.
And interestingly, we apparently have to be grateful to Michelle Obama for actually bringing it to the fore. So now we have effectively an expropriated and exploited proportion of population. It's a very poor part of northeastern Nigeria. There are questions about if the girls were richer, if it was in Abuja or Lagos, would those girls get lost? But effectively, it's a gender issue, but it's also racialized.
Right.
So can we be as clean as your outline is? And there's obviously capitalism involved as well, in the sense that Nigeria itself is a pariah state. But as you say, the West is more than willing to keep doing deals with it. But I mean, to me, there's more than just a race here. There's gender playing a really serious role, as indeed class formation and so on. Thank you.
Well, that's absolutely true, and on my mind, for sure. Again, I mean, I've written so much on gender and relatively little on race, and I feel right now, because largely of the US situation where I am living, but I'm also mindful of what I know goes on elsewhere in the world, including the Nigerian situation. I am really trying to think this question with race front and center. For me, that could never mean forgetting about class, forgetting about gender, and so on. And there are places, I have some real questions that I need to face, theoretical questions that are right now hovering a little bit in the background. You might have noticed that there were a couple of times when I referred to the expropriation of unwaged labor of family members in semi-proletarian households. So what I have to decide is whether I want to think of domestic labor as a form of expropriation or not. That's a huge question and a very important question. And I did mention covered beings and so on and so forth as, you know, another kind of that status of dependency that means you lack protection for claiming the right not to be expropriated. So even at that theoretical level, I have a big decision to make as to whether I want to somehow collapse these two things in a single category or not. And I think there are going to be advantages and disadvantages. It's going to take me quite a while to figure that one out. But note that I'm referring to the expropriation of enslaved women's reproductive capacities, subordinated or I mean, utilized, instrumentalized, or not, according to planters' calculations of profitability. Is it better to buy slaves while the trade is still going, or to breed? I mean, so I mean, there are obviously gendered forms of expropriation that are, even apart from questions about domestic labor. And I want to bring all of those out as well. And I would need to know more about what Boko Haram thinks it's doing with these girls. I mean, is it to service soldiers and militants sexually? I mean, what are they doing exactly? And so, I mean, this certainly does seem to be a form of expropriation, for sure. But to what end, and what is the relation between that expropriation and capitalism more broadly is probably something I don't know enough about to answer.
But I think it's wonderful to answer a question with a question.
Okay.
And it takes us really nicely now to an opportunity for some socialization over a glass of wine, if you're able to stay, and a chance for some informal conversation with each other and also with Nancy. So before we thank Nancy again, I'd like to thank some very important people who made tonight possible. Firstly, our colleague Colin Campbell, back there. Our very able doctoral students, coordinated by Alan Mackey. He's up at the back.
Thank you.
Nancy, thank you so much, and we look forward to continued conversation over the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.